Donna, would you please introduce yourself as a part of our core ECHO team?
Yeah, my name is Donna LaChapelle, and I'm one of the elders in residence here at NACC, and I'm glad to be with all of you today.
Michelle, would you introduce yourself, please?
There we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Corcoran. I'm the nurse supervisor for the MAT program at NACC. Thanks for joining us.
Nikki?
Hi, I'm Nikki Jardina. I'm the infectious disease nurse at NACC.
Tina?
Hi, I'm Tina. I'm the HIV case manager at NACC.
Susan, would you introduce yourself as our guest speaker?
Yeah, hi, Beaulieu. My name is Susan Beaulieu. I am an extension educator with the Center for Family Development, Family Resiliency through the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm a citizen of the Red Lake Nation, but I live in central Minnesota with my family. So I'm super happy to be here today with you all.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Kari Rabi. I'm the medical officer and a family practice physician in addiction medicine here at NACC. Tina, can we start? Thank you. So welcome to the Midwest Tribal ECHO. Today, we've already had our prayer and land acknowledgement. I'm doing the introductions and agenda, and I'm going to go through Zoom guidelines. Tina will do the announcements. We have our didactic around ACEs, historical trauma and resilience for tribal communities by Susan Beaulieu today. No case presentation today, and then we'll close. At this point in the pandemic, I think we all know how to use Zoom, but just as a reminder, you can introduce yourself in the chat function. Please use your name, title, organization, and email. You can also update your name on your screen by right-clicking and renaming it so people can see who you are. Next slide. And then we do ask respectfully if you could turn your cameras on so we can see you. It makes it a lot easier for the presenter and for us when we're having conversation. If we can see each other, we don't mind if you're eating or if your house is a mess or whatever else is going on in your lives. But of course, we will respect if you don't feel you can turn it on. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. If we are hearing noise coming from your camera, we may mute it for you. So please don't be offended. You can use the chat or hand raise function for attention. And as always, no protected health information, please. I'm going to turn it over to Tina for announcements.
Just as a reminder, this ECHO meets every first and third Wednesday of the month from noon until 1 p.m. Next session is happening March 2nd, and Southside Harm Reduction Services will be presenting on safe consumption sites. And then on March 16th, Dr. Rabi will be delivering a presentation called Why Buprenorphine. And then Stratus Health, who is our partner in this project, also has another ECHO called the Opioid Use Disorder Education and Treatment ECHO series with Dr. Heather Bell and Kurt Devine. And that happens the first and third Tuesdays of each month from 12:15 to 1:15. And if you want information about that ECHO, please just put something in the chat and I will send you the information. There's also an MOUD treatment virtual bootcamp recording. So this was a live session that was recorded and it's now on YouTube. I think it's about 4 hours. We've heard really good things about it. So the link is in this presentation, but of course I can just send it to you if you would like it. Case presentations. So everyone is welcome and encouraged to send us a case presentation or clinical questions that you wanted to discuss with people. We would discuss them during this session at the end of the presentations. We don't have one today, but it's always an option that we can build them into these sessions. This is a great way for us to learn from each other and with each other. Difficult cases or success stories make for great discussion. So if you have a case presentation that you wanted to bring to the table, please just reach out to me. You can send me a chat or send me an email. And then lastly, this session is if eligible people are able to receive continuing education credits. I will be sending out an email after the session is over with an evaluation survey. Everyone will receive this. In order to receive your CMEs, though, you have to complete the survey. So just as a reminder to everyone, please introduce yourself in the chat, name, institution, and drop your email in there as well. That'd be really helpful. And so now I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Tina. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can do this. Can you see my slides okay? Okay, excellent. So Beaulieu, thank you so much for coming today. Even though I've done this presentation many times, it always is something that I find incredibly important to share, because this journey has sort of been both a professional and a personal one of understanding the interconnection of all of these things, of historical trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and what healing and resilience looks like and means. So I definitely want to leave time for questions. So I'm gonna sort of just get into it. We'll sort of, I'll do an overview of like trauma, sort of what it is. We'll talk a little bit about ACEs and epigenetics. We're going to look at the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, what happens in the body when we go into that fight or flight response. We'll be talking a little bit about trauma and well, not so much neurodevelopment, but more how trauma wires the brain. And then we'll get in some practices for resetting the nervous system and building resilience. So, you know, I know Donna is incredibly familiar with this, and hopefully many of you are as well, but I really like to start my presentations with a grounding practice. And I find soft belly to be a really accessible breath practice that can really help to ground us in our bodies and also ground us collectively, energetically in this space together. So I'd invite you to get your body into a comfortable position, whatever that feels like for you. And if closing your eyes feels good, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, just having a soft gaze at whatever's in front of you, trying to minimize any visual distractions and inputs out here. So we'll begin by bringing our attention to the breath. And as you breathe in through the nose, I invite you to bring that breath deep into the belly. Imagining the belly is like a balloon, that as you inhale in through the nose, you're filling that balloon up with air. And then you're slowly releasing the air, exhaling out through the mouth. So just continuing to breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth at whatever pace is comfortable for you. Expanding that belly just a little bit more on the inhale and making that exhale just a little bit longer with each breath. And if it's helpful for you, you can think to yourself soft as you breathe in through the nose and belly as you breathe out through the mouth, to remind yourself to keep your body and your belly nice and relaxed, to let that air come deep into the diaphragm, and also to help you keep your focus on your breath. The mind is used to wandering and going where it wants. And so this practice and saying soft belly as we're breathing can help us to keep our focus and attention on the breath. Taking one more nice big breath, inhaling in through the nose, exhaling out through the mouth. And as you bring yourself back fully into the space, maybe gently opening your eyes, just taking a moment to check in with your body, how your body feels in this moment, your emotions, where your emotions at, your mind, and then also your sense of connection to self and others. So just checking in with those different parts of who we are, noticing where we're at in this moment. All right. So I wanted to start with this slide. This is a slide by Stephen Porges, and I'm taking a class right now with someone named Thomas Hubel, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. But I found this incredibly helpful, sort of framing and thinking about how our nervous system works and what that looks like. And so on the green down there, you see that's when we're in our ventral vagal. That's when we're in that calm, relaxed state where we feel open and curious. It's easy for us to connect with one another. We're able to be present and in the moment to really feel joy, and we feel a sense of groundedness in that. When our amygdala, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, when it perceives threat, one of the things that happens is we go into fight or flight. And so when a threat is detected, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and we move into this state where we are preparing to fight or to flee the situation. And so you can see in the flight, as our nervous system is getting activated, you can see panic, fear, worry, concern. That's that flight response. When we're noticing that in our body, our desire is to run away, to leave, to get away from the situation. Or we might be activated in this fight, like I'm going to stand my ground and I'm going to take care of this. I can do this. But you might notice those emotions of rage, anger, irritation, and frustration. So that's when our sympathetic nervous system gets activated. When that system is activated for too long, and we'll talk more about this, we don't have the supports that we need internally or externally to be able to regulate the nervous system. If we're not designed to be in that constant state of fight or flight. And so the sort of wisdom of trauma, and both Gabor Mate and Thomas Hubel talk about this, is that there's this place where we end up sort of shutting that part down, and we move into the dorsal vagal, which is actually an activation of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, where we go into more dissociative state, numbing, depression, helplessness, shutdown, feeling trapped. And we'll talk a lot more about what each of these stages are. But just that recognition that just because someone might not look like they're hyper aroused doesn't mean that they aren't in fact very much in their sympathetic nervous system, but also with the parasympathetic activated. So these are the two people that I referenced who have really shaped the way that I think about trauma, the way that I personally work with my own trauma and work with others who also have unresolved trauma. And something that's super helpful around this is this recognition that they both have, that this trauma energy, and it's an energy, everything is an energy. This trauma energy didn't start with our generation or our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation. This energy has been around for thousands of years. And another way that they sort of frame trauma that's been really helpful is that so Gabor says that there's a difference between a traumatic event and trauma. The traumatic event is the thing that happened, but trauma is what gets stuck inside of us, in our body, in our energetic field, when we don't have the internal or the external resources to be able to navigate through that energy that's coming up. So we're having these big emotional responses that are coming up with the activation of the nervous system. And if we don't have those tools, so for example, soft belly would be a tool that could help to regulate the nervous system. Relationships, and we'll talk more about that, are a key piece for helping to mitigate and offset and move through these big emotions and this energy. When those aren't present, we cannot stay in that activated state and still be, what's the word I'm looking for? Still be functional. We go into these sort of like freeze or rage states. And so what we have to do is we have to separate that energy off. We have to separate that part of ourselves. And Thomas talks about that it's like we park that energy, that experience in a numb place, in a place that we can't feel it. Because as long as we feel it, we feel overwhelmed by it. So we park it in a numb place. And we're going to do a practice later where we're going to sort of notice the connection that we have to different parts of our body, and maybe start to notice places that are numb, either whether it's in our body or whether it's in our emotions. But so recognition of that numbness can give us some insights into areas where maybe we're holding something that that is unresolved yet. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the ACEs, the original ACEs study was done in the early 1990s by Dr. Rob Anda and Vincent Folletti, Dr. Folletti. And the pyramid that you see on the left side that starts with ACEs, that's the original pyramid. So when I was trained, this is what we were taught. You know, the ACEs lead to the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which then can lead to disease, disability, and social problems and early death. And so it's this life cycle. But as we were going out and we were doing presentations in BIPOC communities, Indigenous communities, we were like, wait a minute, our communities didn't start with ACEs. There was something that was driving these adverse childhood experiences and these patterns and cycles that we see in our families and communities. And so they added these pieces of generational embodiment and historical trauma. So that again goes back to thinking about that trauma energy that's thousands of years old, and thinking about the things that happen to the Indigenous, us as Indigenous people in this country and around the world, as well as Black and African American people. So thinking about those historical trauma contexts, which then leads to or creates these social conditions and local contexts, which then create these complex trauma cycles and adverse childhood experiences, which lead to the overwhelm, the allostatic load. So that's again, when that nervous system, when there's too much going on there and disrupted neurodevelopment, because our brains are wired through experience, which then when there's that constant overwhelm, if we don't have the internal and external resources, we turn to coping mechanisms. So we might turn to substances, we might turn to work, there's workaholics, right? We might turn to our phones nowadays. We might turn to other things that will distract us and pull us out of that emotional overwhelm that we're experiencing. And then some of these coping mechanisms, of course, lead to disease, distress, and they can lead to all sorts of social problems and challenges, incarceration, et cetera. And again, early death. So you can see along the other side, you have things like microaggressions, implicit bias, epigenetics. All of these things play a role and reinforce a lot of these patterns, both at the individual and societal levels. So the original ACEs, these are the 10 that they looked at. And this was really based on sort of the literature at the time and what they thought was most impactful. But what we know now, and based on sort of how Thomas and Gabor Mate talk about trauma, is that trauma is really anything that overwhelms the nervous system, that we don't have those individual or collective resources to navigate through what's coming up. So in the original ACEs study, there were sort of 3 areas. Under those areas, you have the first one is abuse, with physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Under neglect, there's emotional and physical neglect. And then under household dysfunction, you have things like mental illness of a primary caregiver, incarcerated relative, domestic violence, substance use issues within the immediate family, and also separation or divorce. And that piece around separation or divorce speaks to all of the bickering, the fighting, the chaos that happens within the household. So that's what creates that toxic environment for the child. Just really quickly, because I didn't specifically say this, but these are not the only ACEs that can happen to a young person. And these really look at what's happening within a household. It doesn't necessarily look at what's happening within the community or within the larger society. So again, there are all of these other things that play in and impact how trauma shows up. One of the things that they found in the ACE study, besides the fact that they are very common across all groups, whether you're talking about socioeconomic status, you're talking about race, ethnicity, gender, it doesn't matter. ACEs are really common. But something important that they found is the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to experience not just negative health outcomes, but poor social outcomes and relationship outcomes, because this unresolved trauma impacts us at all of these levels: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So the more ACEs, the more likely. And I just want to really highlight that ACEs is not a one-to-one. Like if you have a high ACE score, you are destined for, you know, these poor health outcomes. That it's a population study. So it's looking at sort of epidemiologically, this is what they found across the groups. There's lots of individual mitigating factors that can make it so that this is not the case for somebody who has high ACEs, which is great news, right? These are just a snippet of what they consider ACE attributable problems. So problems individually that can be attributed to ACEs. There's also all sorts of social ones that can be attributed to ACEs, but everything from substance use disorders, having a hard time getting a job, keeping a job, diabetes, depression, COPD, cancer, stroke, heart disease, lots of different physical issues. And one of the things that I want to, as I was learning about ACEs and making the connection to what I was seeing both in my family and in the Indigenous communities I was working with, it made a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, we definitely have high ACEs, but what I didn't understand and have since come to understand is why high ACEs lead to these ACE attributable problems. And so for me, really understanding the nervous system was an important piece of that. So we're going to dig into that in just a minute. But you can see that with unresolved trauma, and there are these individual and social outcomes. So there's a high correlation between addiction and unresolved trauma. You know, some studies go as high as 80% correlation, or 75%, two-thirds of those in recovery for addiction have experienced one or more ACE. That's not 75%. I'm not good at math. Two-thirds. Research that really shows that incarcerated populations tend to have significantly higher ACEs than the non-incarcerated populations. And this includes our children who end up in juvenile justice systems and then down the pipeline as well. So another piece that was really helpful in understanding how this trauma gets transmitted or passed down is understanding epigenetics. And so I'll say a couple things about it, and then I'll share a little bit about what I learned when in the last few months, we had a conversation with Dr. Diaz, who is one of the original researchers on the epigenetic study. So epi means to sit on top of, and epigenetics is what sits on top of our genetic code. I remember a really robust, and maybe many of you do too, debate about, is it nature, is it nurture, like which is it? And the reality is that it's both. So we show up with a set of genetic, a set of genetics given to us by our parents and passed along. But the experiences that we have can turn on or turn off genetic code. The study, sort of what they found in this is they would take male mice and they had them in cages, and in the bottom of the cages they had shock pads. So every time they would infuse the scent of cherry blossom, they would shock the feet of the mice. And of course, after doing this a number of times, an association was made for the mice between the smell and the pain. So they took that first generation of mice and they bred them to females. The females had pups. They let the pups grow up. They didn't do anything to them while they were growing up. But once they were fully grown, they did just the scent of cherry blossom. And those little mice had a stress response. They were shaking. They were trying to get out of their cage. They were climbing on top of each other. They took the second generation. They bred them to females. Females had pups. They let the pups grow up. That third generation, scent of cherry blossom, same fear response. But in addition, there had been some changes in their in the nose, to be able to pick up the scent of cherry blossom, in addition to some changes in the brain. So you can see through this study that epigenetics shows us that sometimes there are things that happen in the experience of our ancestors that gets passed on. And usually when I do these presentations, when I ask the question, what is the purpose of this? Almost always it's survival, right? Because the first generation might not be around to tell the second and third generations, hey, you have to be careful for this thing. So if they can pass that down through epigenetics, through what genes get turned on or turned off, that increases the chance of survival for future generations. Now, the challenge comes in is that sometimes some of those things that get passed on might not be helpful for us anymore. So we might find ourselves responding in ways that actually might make a situation worse, but that initial response and reactivity might actually be coming from an experience that an ancestor had. And all that being said, I also want to reinforce that because epigenetics is about survival, it is not just the trauma that gets passed on, it is also the strengths and resiliency of our ancestors that gets passed on. So I think that's really important to recognize. One of the things that Dr. Diaz said that I thought that really blew my mind is that we have like this, we have like a calendar clock, right? Every year we turn a year older, every day we're a day older. So we have like sort of by the calendar, but then we also have a biological clock. And what happens with trauma is that trauma speeds up the biological clock. It's like it makes it so that the body is aging more quickly. Some of the research that they found around like telomeres, which are an indicator of the length or the life of a cell, and the shorter the telomeres get, the shorter or like the older the biological age. And so caregivers, for example, who are in stressful situations where they're caring for a loved one and they're under that constant stress, their telomeres actually get shortened from the stress. So our stress impacts our biological age. So this is important when we're thinking, especially about young people, that sometimes those windows, those critical windows of development, whether it's certain brain opportunities, like critical windows in the brain development or physical development, those get sped up, those windows get shorter, is what Dr. Diaz said. So you might experience, young people who are going through menstruation, or young girls who are menstruating earlier, or you might experience like some of the, when we think about the teenage brain and how right before puberty, it is rewiring itself and pruning away old things and, reinforcing some of the things that we've done over and over again. That window also gets shorter because that's another window, a critical window for potential intervention. So recognizing that these windows might be different for individuals and communities that we work with that have experienced a lot of trauma, I think is important to recognize. So I had mentioned, as I've come to understand this, and especially the mind-body medicine work that I do really help to plant this seed and help me to understand that the key is the nervous system, understanding what the nervous system is, what it does, and what part of the nervous system we're in from moment to moment. So in our autonomic nervous system, they call it automatic because they used to think, it controls all sorts of things that, thank goodness, we don't have to think about. Our heart rate, our blood pressure, our, a bunch of hormones. It controls a whole bunch of things that we don't have to think about. Does it automatically. But we also can tap into it. So we have the ability to tap into the autonomic nervous system and to actually impact which part of the nervous system we're in. So there's two parts to this. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which is the part that gets activated when the amygdala perceives a threat. It's our fight or flight response, that survival response. And this is really critical for short-term survival. If we didn't have this part of our nervous system, we wouldn't be sitting here today. Our ancestors would not have survived the things that they survived if we didn't have this part of our nervous system. So it's really, really important, but it's needed for short-term survival. So we'll talk more about what the challenge is when this continues to stay on. Then you also have the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is more of what they call the rest and digest. When our body is in this state, we feel that's that dorsal vagal on the bottom, that green, if you remember that slide that I showed, where we feel just a sense of groundedness and connection. Our body is able to heal in this state. It's not trying to use energy to help us run and fight and all that. It's able to use that energy to digest our food and to heal parts of our body. So this part of our nervous system is critical for long-term survival. So this is another way to think about it. I think about the sympathetic nervous system sort of like the gas on the car. It's going to get us up and going. It's going to help us survive the situation. And the parasympathetic nervous system, when the situation's been alleviated or been resolved, we can push on the brake and our nervous system can come back into the parasympathetic. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the stress response. And these are the 4 main ones, but there are other ways that we can respond to stress. But these are the main ones that we know and that we often talk about. So fight, flight, freeze, and faint. So fight and flight. When we are in our nervous system, there are some really important things that happen in our body to be able to activate our body and to be able to increase our chances of surviving the threat. The first thing that happens is we get a rush of adrenaline, and that adrenaline increases our heart rate, it increases our respirations, and this is to get more oxygenated blood out to all parts of the body. This is so that we can run faster and fight harder. We need that oxygenated blood for our body to be able to work at its optimal. There's more blood vessels that open up in certain parts of the body. And then there's others that constrict. So you might notice when you're in the fight or flight, cold hands, cold feet, cold nose. Blood gets diverted from those areas of the body and goes to the torso and the large muscle groups to be able to increase our chances of survival. Cortisol gets released into our blood. What this does is it shuts down our digestion, because if we have a threat and we don't survive it, digesting breakfast, lunch, or dinner doesn't matter. And digestion actually takes quite a bit of energy for the body. So it diverts that energy away from digestion to other parts of the body, releases glucose, which is a form of energy, again, so we can run faster, fight harder. And initially there's this immune system bump, but over time, our immune system actually, again, immune system takes a lot of energy. And so we can't stay in that high immune system state. And so our immune system goes down, which is why when people are under prolonged stress, they are much more susceptible to bacteria, to viruses, to illness. And then our muscles also get tense and tight. We're preparing to run, we're preparing to fight. So you'll notice that constriction in the legs, in the shoulders, in the arms. And then also when we're in this state, our senses get heightened, our sense of sound, right? Because we're listening for the threat, what we see and we perceive. So our certain parts of our senses get heightened to help us try to understand what's happening with the threat and how to best survive it. But when this system stays on or is on continuously, it's on and then it's off, but then it's on again. So we're really talking about that toxic stress. You know, there's different kinds of stress. We're talking about toxic stress, or that constant activation can lead to things like high blood pressure, stroke, heart attack, type 2 diabetes. If our body is constantly getting a dump of glucose, I remember when my dad was alive, he was diabetic and he had PTSD. He was a Vietnam vet. When he was really stressed out, it didn't matter what he ate, how much he exercised. It was really hard for him to regulate his blood sugar levels. But that's because his body was getting that constant dump of glucose. It can lead to inflammation, digestive issues. Again, if your digestion is turning on and off, autoimmune disorders, anxiety, depression, muscle tension, and pain, and sleep problems. So as I was learning about this, it was like, oh, well, so many of these are things that we talk about as the impact of ACEs, right? So another thing that can happen, and this was really interesting to me when I was first learning about this, I was listening to Dr. Bruce Perry, and he was talking about, if you think again about that graph I showed you of Stephen Porges, or the one from Stephen Porges, this is an activation of both the sympathetic nervous system and then the parasympathetic nervous system. Because if we can't run from something, or if we can't fight our way out of it, the wisdom of trauma is that it knows we can't stay in that hyperactivated state. And so it deactivates a lot of these things. Our blood pressure decreases, our heart rate decreases, our slowing decreases. Our body might go rigid, or it might go limp. Our brain releases natural endogenous chemicals and anesthetic neurochemicals in preparation for being injured, because we can't run or fight from it. So all of these things are happening in our system. And in addition, the sensory information that's coming in gets dulled. It's sort of numbed out because of these numbing agents, which means that impacts our memory. When we, it's not funny, but it's interesting to me now. I used to always say, oh, I have a terrible memory, because I have very few memories of childhood. But as I started practicing mindfulness and being present and noticing, like, what am I feeling? What am I smelling? What am I hearing? You know, I'm paying attention to my senses. All of a sudden, I start remembering things much better than I ever did before. So getting out of this sort of dissociative state back into a more present state allowed my memory to improve. So it wasn't just that I had a bad memory, it's that I literally, because of my experiences, had trained myself when I got activated to not be present, to dissociate and check out. So when we have this overactivation of this, it can lead to, like I just mentioned, impaired memory, dissociative disorders. And it's also really hard on the body, because even though the parasympathetic nervous system is activated, our sympathetic nervous system is still activated underneath that. And so sometimes when people are shifting out of a dissociative state, they might actually move back into fight or flight, where they get angry again, or they're feeling anxious again before they get back down to that green state. Again, thinking of that Stephen Porges graph, right? So, we get out of the sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic also, but when we're coming back down and trying to reground and balance the nervous system, we might notice some of those feelings that were overwhelming for us at first coming back up again, because they're still there. So I mentioned this, but just really quickly, our brain wires through experience. So you can see on the left side, that's sort of what the neural connections at birth look like. There aren't very many. There are some, and there are some experiences, really important ones we've had in utero that wire the brain in certain ways, and I'll talk more about that later. But we haven't had a lot of experiences yet. But you can see from birth to age 7, there's an explosion of neural connections that are made. So during this time of the brain, 0 to 5 especially, the brain is wired to take in information and make sense of it, to process it, to try to categorize. I think of it like this, like we really take it for granted, but just take a moment and look around your space, paying attention to lighting, to shapes, to sound, to smells. There's all sorts of things that are happening around us that we don't have to think about and process anymore. We know it's daytime, the light is out, oh, that's a circle. That sound by my feet, that's the fan, right? So like there's things that we don't have to process anymore. That's because through our experience, we've learned how to make sense of our world. When children are babies, that's what their brains are trying to do, is make sense of their world. So one of the things that you might notice in that 7-year range is that there are some connections that are really robust. They are thicker. Those are the experiences that have happened over and over repetitively. So those get wired in a really strong way. The saying is like, what fires together wires together. So we're just going to do a really quick example of this. So please humor me. And if you have your arms crossed, go ahead and uncross them. And then let's cross our arms, and then notice what arm is on top, right or left. Okay, and then we'll shake them out, and then cross it so that the other arm is on top. How'd that go? For some of us, we maybe had to think the second time, right?
Yeah, I couldn't do it.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I couldn't do it. I tried really hard. Like, I don't know how do you do it?
Practice, right?
I mean, I have a PhD. I can figure this out. Hold on a second.
It's a great reminder that when we're learning something new, it takes a lot of attention and focus to figure it out. But once we figure it out, like crossing our arms the way that we always do, we don't have to think about it anymore, right? It becomes automatic. So I love that example, because the other thing that it reminds me of is when we cross our arms the other way, if we can figure it out, right, is it feels uncomfortable. There's this desire to go back to what we know because it's comfortable. And so sometimes as we're moving through and navigating these trauma responses that we have, doing things in a different way might feel really uncomfortable, but that discomfort doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's different, right? So I think that's really important to recognize. And then I had mentioned, right before puberty, the brain is like reorganizing itself and pruning away stuff that, it's like, oh, you didn't you know, you took that test on it one time, you don't need to remember that, like whatever it is, whatever the saying is, use it or lose it. So whatever we're not using on a regular basis, or we haven't wired in really strongly, those things are going to get pruned away, because the brain is like really prime real estate. Neural connections are, you know, they're hard fought and hard won a lot of times. So, so this is another really important thing to recognize about how the brain works and develops. So another piece that has been really helpful for me is understanding the amygdala hijack. So we talked about what happens in the body when we're having a stress response, but there's some really important things that are happening in the brain too. And Dr. Dan Siegel has this handy model of the brain. So again, I would encourage you to just humor me. But so the handy model goes like this. So this part here would be your, if you would all raise your hand, this would be like your spinal cord. And this part here would be the base of your brain, sort of your brainstem area. If you fold your thumb in, touch the palm of your hand, this would be like your amygdala, hippocampus, and then folding your fingers over. This is the cortex, and the prefrontal cortex, the thinking rational part of the brain, is right here. So as information is coming in, it's being processed up through the spinal cord, the brainstem, it gets to the amygdala. If the amygdala perceives it as a threat, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? Because if we literally are under threat, we don't want to be sitting here thinking, like, if I'm being chased by a cougar, I don't want to be like, should I run, or should I play dead, or maybe I should climb a tree? I don't have time for that. I have to respond. So again, anytime there's a threat and the amygdala doesn't know the difference between a threat that is actually in front of us and just a threat in our mind, a perceived threat. You know, my supervisor had, you know, sent me an email and wants to talk with me today. I wonder what she wants, right? Like, it can even just be those perceived threats that activate the stress response and hijack. You have an amygdala hijack. Another thing that I have found super helpful is to understand that the other thing the brain doesn't differentiate or know the difference between is pain, physical pain and emotional pain. The brain processes the pain as pain. So I remember I went to a conference, it was a handful of, or probably about 7 years ago now. And the researcher who was researching pain said that in her lab, they brought in people who were experiencing lots of emotional pain. So maybe the death of a loved one or a relationship that ended or something like that. And they would give them ibuprofen or Tylenol and they felt better. Right? So again, the brain doesn't know the difference between physical pain, I broke my leg, and emotional pain, my partner left. It doesn't know the difference. It just experiences pain and it processes it as pain, And so this also, as the work I've been doing with people struggling with opioid use disorders and different things like that, it's helpful to understand that, boy, opioids sure work well for pain, don't they? And again, if our brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain, that definitely plays a part in that.
Susan, when you say they felt better, quote unquote, felt better, like in the study, did they report physiologically feeling better or emotional, or both?
Both. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And it's another great example, Anthony, of how our mind and our bodies are so connected. Our mind, our body, and our emotions are all connected. They are all connected and they impact one another.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I've come to understand all of this information, I really see one of the keys is resetting the autonomic nervous system. So, you know, when I think about those of us who have experienced a lot of trauma and or our ancestors experiencing a lot of trauma, because this is another important thing. There was a researcher that was speaking at the International Trauma Conference, and they did this study where they had mothers who had high ACEs, but they were not in, like traumatic or difficult situations during their pregnancy, but they followed the experience of those babies. And even if those babies did not, as they were growing up, didn't experience ACEs themselves, because their mother's nervous systems were dysregulated from their own trauma in utero, those babies' brains were getting wired because of the stress hormones of the mother. And so those babies, as they grew up, they were more quickly activated into the fight or flight response. Did you have a question, Anthony?
Yeah, I'm curious. So that issue about like the psychological and physiological pain and how those things are married together. One of the things, like, do you know any body of research that has looked at sort of like the spiritual understanding of pain? So one of the things specifically within an indigenous population, I'm always curious about the role that the potential mediating role that spiritually, the spiritual understanding and meaning of pain has for the relevance of sort of kind of intervening in this sort of this structure here, right? Because we have ceremonies and all these other practices where we sort of kind of like intentionally, in a ceremonial way, we sort of like, you know, voluntarily sort of put ourselves into painful situations, right?
Right.
180-degree sweat is not like something
Right. Yeah.
that people just sort of voluntarily sign up for.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious about that. I'm really interested in that sort of like the intersectionality of those things. And I don't know of a body of research that has looked at that.
To my knowledge, there's not a body of research that's looked at that. I feel like within both the mental health and physical health, models, we're just finally starting to understand how the mind, the body, and the emotions are all connected, much less the spiritual aspect, right? So, I think that that's definitely a challenge that we have, is that we're just finally starting to understand how these other parts of ourselves are connected, but there's still quite a bit of resistance to incorporating that spiritual aspect. But and I know, and many of us know on this call as Indigenous people, we believe that we are first and foremost spiritual beings in human bodies, having human experiences like thoughts and emotions and all of the sort of physical nature that these physical bodies allow our spirit to experience. And so I think we're a little ways off from that yet, but I think that folks like maybe yourself and others like
in my free time, I'll research it.
Right, who are really interested in really making these connections, because they are critical to understanding. And
my hypothesis there would be is like the spiritual part of it gives it a container, right?
Yes.
So like when you can kind of wrap your hands around something, I mean, when I think like psychologically, emotionally, physically, you can wrap your understanding around something and what you're experiencing phenomenologically, you have a lot more control over it. You have a lot more, you don't feel so much like a bystander in that process, right? So I think that's something to, anyway, be a really interesting research project for all of you who are listening on the
it totally would be. Yeah. So if you're ever game, let me know. I'm willing to help, but I can't lead that charge. So
cool.
Great question. So coming back to the nervous system and really exploring ways that we can regulate again, both at the individual and collective level, because this is the other piece of it, is that our nervous systems are connected. My nervous system right now is impacting your nervous system. And if I'm looking at you, your nervous system is impacting my nervous system. And sometimes even when we're not looking at each other. So for example, think about like if you're out in public and all of a sudden you feel like get this weird, like, is someone looking at me? You turn around and someone is looking at you, right? Like our bodies are very good at sensing and picking up on other people sensing us or what's happening in other people's nervous systems. And this too is a survival mechanism, right? So like if one person is really afraid, and I notice that in my nervous system, that's going to activate me to try like what's going on here, which is going to increase my chances of survival, as opposed to if I didn't pick up on that and I'm just sitting here hanging out and all of a sudden like, a car comes barreling through an area where you're sitting in a outdoor restaurant, right? So again, like this ability to tune into other people's nervous systems is a critical part of our human survival. Are we okay? So I just looked at the time. Do we only have 8 minutes left?
We have 8 minutes.
All right. So I apologize. I get going. So we're gonna sort of go through these quickly. If you want me to come back, I would love to like really dig into these pieces here at another time if you're interested.
We would definitely love for you to come back.
Yeah, I was going to say we could do a two-parter or a
Okay.
three-parter. How many parts you need?
So I'm just going to do a high overview of this, and then we'll save some time for questions. So thinking about how do we build those individual capacities and capabilities? How do we tap into and build the larger like relationship supports that we need, and then that larger rung out community culture and spirituality? So I think of these as like nested bowls. They impact one another. How healthy and well I am impacts how healthy and well my family and those I interact with is, which impacts how healthy and well our community is. How healthy and well our community is impacts the people that are around me. How healthy and well they are impacts my health and well-being. So all of these things are connected and impacting one another. So individual capabilities, I won't get into it, but positive view, self-efficacy, and self-regulation are critical tools to build, to practice and to build. These are some examples of tools to regulate and organize the brain. This comes from Dr. Bruce Perry. A lot of these are practices that in Indigenous people we had and we still have. Drumming, music, singing, chanting, dancing, swaying, all of these things help to regulate the nervous system and organize the brain. Here's some more things: meditative breathing, yoga, tai chi, etc., grooming, equine grooming and riding. Attachment and belonging, I won't get into it. So important. I could do a whole piece on just attachment and belonging. I love this quote by Dr. Bruce Perry, though: your regulated nervous system is the intervention. A lot of times people that are working with others who are struggling or having a difficult time, they want to know, like, what can I say or what can I do? The most powerful thing we can do is regulate our own nervous system, because again, their nervous system is going to pick up on ours, whether we're regulated or not. And that's going to impact their ability to regulate their nervous system. And then community, culture, and spirituality. And so we'll definitely get into that later, along with this larger piece of spirituality, remembering that we are interconnected and connected beyond just the sort of immediate what we see, feel, taste, touch, hear. I'm wondering if, so we have 5 minutes left. Can we just do 4 mindful breaths together? Is that okay? Just to sort of like wrap this up, and then we can go into questions and reflections. So again, just inviting you to sort of bring your attention inward. And as we take this first breath, noticing all the ways that the body moves and expands with the inhale. And then how the body moves and adjusts again as the air leaves the body. Just watching this process of the body breathing itself as you breathe at your own pace. Second mindful breath. Another mindful breath. And then let's close with a final grounding breath. Just a really nice big inhale in through the nose. Exhaling slowly out of the mouth. All right, miigwech. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see faces. So I apologize. I do have a tendency to do that because I'm like, it's all important, it's all connected to understand these pieces. But then I usually end up not always getting through absolutely everything that I want. So I appreciate the opportunity, if you want to have me back, to really dig into that last section more.
Absolutely, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we can talk scheduling afterwards.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I would just open it up for any questions. And I know some stuff, but I'm definitely not an expert. I know there are lots of you on this call that also have a lot of experience and wisdom in this. So we sort of opening that up, and then any reflections or new insights that you have that help you understand either your own lived experiences a little better, or maybe the lived experiences of the individuals in your family or community or the people that you work with.
I just thought it would be interesting to highlight sort of the different pathways to addressing this, like the conversation that we had before we got on, just like that there's no, like that there's ways to address trauma, and that there's multiple different ways to address trauma. and not, and the conversation that we had, that it's like a smart, like a buffet table, like it's not just one thing that you can choose to do.
Right. Yeah, and to sort of piggyback on that, what I found in my own journey and process is that sometimes there might be a tool that's really helpful in one place, and then I need something else to get me through into that next layer, to go deeper into something, right? So that, like, not that the previous practice, it can't still be helpful, but maybe it can't take me quite to the depth that I need or the understanding. And so recognizing that there are different tools and practices that help us to tap into different parts of who we are and different parts of our experience in different ways that can be really helpful for the healing, and as Thomas would say, the integration, the reintegration of that energy and that trauma experience. Justin, did you have something you want to bring in?
I'm specifically curious because all the things it's interesting because as you do your talk and we do some breathing, and the content of your talk is about the nervous system, and actually, like, I feel my nervous system calm down. And so what's interesting is that that's sort of a profound here and now experience. But I'm struggling with the way that the conventional mental health system is attached to diagnoses like PTSD, where they're not accounting for these things, and they're essentially locking out an understanding of the nervous system, of treatment, and they're kind of discounting this experience. I'm wondering, like, are you pushing up on for different understandings of like a PTSD diagnosis? How do you find bumping into some of these conventions?
I think that is a great question. I feel like we literally could do a whole session on just that, on how that sort of the confinement and the constrictions of the current existing mental health models, or even physical health models, right? You have high blood pressure, we give you a pill for that, as opposed to checking in with, how is your nervous system, and, what were your experiences in childhood, and, what are some practices that you can do today? So I feel like, sort of like what Anthony was saying earlier, asking about the spiritual aspect, like within our larger systems, we are not at this point yet of really understanding. And when I say understanding, it's not just a head knowing, because I feel like there's more head knowing about some of this stuff, but an actual integration of like, so how do we use this to inform what we do and how we do it and how we show up, right? That to me is the shift from knowledge to wisdom, where we're taking what we know and we're integrating it back into our personal lives. We're integrating it into the systems and the spaces that we work in. So it's definitely an area that needs that push, that needs that greater understanding. And I also know from my own experience, like when you hear something, and this is why I like to incorporate some of the practices when I do presentations, because it's one thing to hear it, but it's another to experience it in your body, to notice where your nervous system is at, to feel a little more relaxation in the body or a little more ease in the breath, right? That when you have an experience with something, it allows you to understand it in a more deep way. And so I think a lot of our systems, there's definitely an invitation for them to start to really integrate what we know. And when I say what we know, it's both like what the science is showing today, but so much of what the science is showing is related back to what traditional indigenous wisdom has always known. So yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like we could probably riff and go on it for hours, but it's a really important question. So miigwech for that.
Oh, miigwech. And so we're gonna we'll just formally end the echo because we have reached time. If anybody has a last question, and just thank everybody for joining. I know people are going off to sessions with patients and other sorts of things, but yeah, any last questions before we wrap up?
I would just add that, the importance of this work with mind and body medicine is that the breath, because it helps us to be present in the body, and to feel that calm so that we can face anything that presents to us. So if we have to address conflict or stress or tragedy, we can do it. We have the capacity to do it. That's why I like this work. And in ceremony, there is no separation. So you go to ceremony and it's one being and you're connected and renewed. So think of that, you know, if you're just present in the body, that's self-care right there. And the breath is your own spirit.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Great, Donna, absolutely. Great for that wisdom.
And I would love to hear more about the resilience piece and the resilience that we carry with us and how that, you know, how that intersects as well. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Susan. I know we're going to be seeing you at a future session soon. We really appreciate having you. Miigwech.
Yeah, thank you so much. Tina, do you want me to stay on or do you want
Yes,
to?
we'll have
Yeah,
the
stay on.
stay on.
I'm gonna stop recording.